Everyone in the showroom laughed the moment he walked through the door. It was the kind of laughter that spreads quickly through a crowd of well-dressed people who have never once considered that they, too, might look out of place somewhere instinctive, careless, and sharp as broken glass. The man standing just inside the entrance was wearing a pair of dark work pants stained with grease along the left knee, a faded canvas jacket that had been washed so many times the original color was impossible to determine, and boots that had clearly seen a decade of hard use. He carried no briefcase, no invitation visibly in hand, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled in the way of someone who had driven with the windows down. He looked, in the most precise terms, like someone who belonged beneath a car rather than beside one worth $500,000. The laughter was loudest, most cutting, most deliberate from a woman standing near the far end of the showroom floor, holding a glass of champagne in one hand and a conversation in the other. Olivia Carter, 29 years old, CEO of Carter Holdings, paused mid-sentence to let the full weight of her amusement land. She looked at the man the way a person looks at something that does not belong to them and never could, and she said something quietly to the security officer standing nearby. The man in the work clothes simply looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a kind of calm that is rarer and more unsettling than either, and then turned and walked back toward the exit. What no one in that room knew, including Olivia herself, was that within the next 30 minutes, the entire evening would change, and it would change because of him. Jack Turner was 38 years old and had been running his garage on the east side of Millbrook for 11 years. The garage was called Turner Restoration, and if you drove past it without knowing what you were looking for, you might not slow down at all. The sign above the bay doors was modest, hand-painted in dark green letters that had faded slightly over the years. The building itself was a converted warehouse with good bones, high ceilings that allowed room for a lift and a pair of halogen work lights, and a side room with a desk where Jack kept his records in a filing system that made sense only to him. He had one full-time employee, a young man named Danny, who had come to him at 17 asking for a summer job and never quite left, and two part-time helpers who came on weekends during busy restoration seasons. The garage did not have a website, did not run advertisements, and did not need to. Every piece of work Jack took in came by word of mouth, and the waiting list for his restorations ran, on average, between 14 and 18 months. He worked on vehicles that most mechanics would not touch, cars from the 1940s and 1950s, and machines whose original parts were no longer manufactured and whose repair required a combination of engineering precision and something that could only be called instinct, a feel for the materials and the era and the specific character of each machine. Jack had both. He had always had both. He was also a single father. His daughter, Maya, was 9 years old, and she came to the garage after school on days when the sitter was unavailable, and she did her homework at a small desk Jack had set up near the side window, eating crackers from a bag and drawing horses in the margins of her notebook. She called his employees by their first names and had a habit of asking technical questions that made Danny laugh and then scramble to answer correctly because she always knew when he was guessing. Jack had raised her alone since she was 3. After her mother left in the way some people leave without ceremony and without much explanation, and he had done so with the same steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything else in his life. He did not talk about it often. He did not talk about most things often. He was a man who communicated through what he did rather than what he said. And what he did, consistently and without fanfare, was exceptional. The invitation to the Millbrook Classic and Collector Automotive Exhibition had arrived 6 weeks earlier in a plain envelope, the kind with a gold foil crest on the back flap. Jack had read it at his desk, set it down, and then gone back to the differential he had been rebuilding. He read it again the following morning over coffee and decided he would go, not because he particularly enjoyed large events with champagne and people in tailored suits, but because the car he had been restoring for the past 2 years, a 1953 Hudson Hornet, originally dark blue, now brought back to a color so precise it matched the paint code in the original factory. Documentation had been selected as a finalist in the collector vehicle category, and he thought it deserved to be seen. The Hudson had come to him in what collectors called barn find condition, meaning it had been sitting in a structure with a leaking roof for somewhere between 20 and 30 years, and the state of the interior, the chrome, the mechanicals, and the bodywork had been, in the most clinical terms, catastrophic. What Jack had done to it over those 2 years was not restoration in the loose sense the word is sometimes used. It was something closer to resurrection. He had not owned a suit he felt comfortable in since his 20s, and the one he found in the back of his closet the night before, the exhibition was slightly too wide in the shoulders and had a lapel width that had gone out of fashion a decade earlier. He tried it on, looked in the mirror for a moment, and decided that it would do. Maya, sitting on the edge of his bed, said it looked fine and that she was proud of his car, and he kissed the top of her head and told her he would be home before 9. He had not accounted for the fact that the jacket was in worse shape than he remembered, and that, during the drive over, he had pulled over to check something under the hood of a neighbor's car that had been making a sound he did not like, and in doing so, had gotten a stripe of grease across the left knee of his pants and a smaller mark on the cuff of his jacket. He had not noticed until he was already parked and walking toward the building. Olivia Carter had been preparing for the exhibition for 3 weeks. Not the exhibition itself, she had attended enough of these events that the logistics were routine, but the particular impression she intended to make at it. Carter Holdings had recently acquired a minority stake in a European performance vehicle manufacturer, and the exhibition represented a natural venue to signal to investors and partners that the company had taste as well as capital. Olivia had worn a gown, the color of dark copper, that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her hair was arranged in a way that looked effortless and was not. She had prepared talking points. She had reviewed the guest list. She had positioned herself near the entrance to the VIP section, where the most important conversations would take place, and she was in the middle of one of them when the security officer leaned close and mentioned, quietly, that there appeared to be a maintenance worker who had wandered into the wrong area. Olivia had glanced over, assessed the situation in less than 2 seconds, and made her decision before she had all the information, which was, though she could not have known it at the time, a habit that would cost her significantly before the night was over. She excused herself from her conversation with a smile and crossed the floor with the particular confidence of someone who has never once doubted her right to be exactly where she is. She stopped a few feet from Jack and looked at him with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite amusement, but occupied the uncomfortable space between the two. She said, clearly enough to be heard by the people immediately around her, "Excuse me, are you aware that this is a restricted area for invited guests?" Jack turned from the car he had been looking at, which happened to be a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in factory original red and white, and he looked at her calmly. He said yes, he was aware. He said he was an invited guest. He said his name was Jack Turner, and one of the cars on display was his. Olivia tilted her head very slightly. She looked at the stain on his pants, and then back at his face. She said, "I'm sure there's been some kind of mix-up." The phrase was delivered in the tone of someone who does not actually believe there has been a mix-up, and who is indicating as much without being willing to say so directly. It was a particular kind of rudeness that presents itself as reasonableness. And it was in some ways worse than a direct insult. The people nearby had fallen quiet in that particular way that happens when something uncomfortable is occurring, and everyone knows it, but no one wants to be the one to address it. A few of them were smiling, in a way that suggested they found the spectacle entertaining. One woman near the champagne station turned very slightly away, as if distance from the scene might excuse her from having witnessed it. A man in a dark blazer studied the hood ornament of the nearest car with sudden intense interest. Nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. Jack did not raise his voice. He did not flush with embarrassment or clench his jaw, or do any of the things a person does when they are fighting the urge to respond to unfairness with equal force. He said, quietly, that he understood, and he turned and walked toward the exit with the same unhurried pace he had entered with, and there was something in the steadiness of that walk, its absolute refusal to be hurried by shame, that 1 or 2 people in the room would find themselves thinking about later, in the way you think about something that doesn't quite fit the category you've assigned it to. Olivia watched him go with the satisfied expression of someone who believes they have managed a situation competently. And then she turned back toward the VIP section and resumed her evening. For approximately 20 more minutes, everything proceeded as she had planned. Richard Carter arrived at 20 minutes past 8, which was late by the standards of an event his company had partially underwritten, and he arrived in the low-key manner of a man who no longer needed to make entrances. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, built with the kind of solidity that comes from having worked physically for a large portion of one's life before moving to a desk, and he had the handshake of someone who means it. He had founded Carter Holdings 40 years earlier from a capital base of $11,000 and an engineering background he had gotten by working nights while studying days, and he was, by any measure, one of the more consequential business people in the state. He had retired from the day-to-day operations of the company 3 years ago, handing operational control to Olivia, in whom he had enormous faith, and he was beginning to recognize some significant blind spots. He greeted a few people near the entrance, accepted a glass of water because he had never developed a taste for champagne, and made his way slowly through the showroom floor. Pausing at a few of the vehicles, he had almost reached the far end of the room when one of the event managers, a nervous young man named Trevor, who had been watching the evening's logistics with the vigilance of someone whose job depended on nothing going wrong, appeared at his elbow and said that he wanted to mention something he had witnessed earlier, in case Mr. Carter felt it was relevant. He described, briefly and with some hesitation, what had happened with Olivia and the man in the work clothes. Richard listened with his glass of water held still in one hand. He asked, when Trevor finished, what the man's name had been. Trevor consulted a clipboard and said the name was Jack Turner, and Richard Carter, who was not a man given to visible displays of emotion and who had negotiated deals in rooms where the wrong expression could cost millions of dollars, went very still. The color drained from his face in a way that was noticeable even in the showroom's warm lighting. The glass of water in his hand tilted, and Trevor reached out and caught it just before it fell. Richard said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Find him and bring him back. Right now." What Richard Carter had never told his daughter, had never told anyone outside of a small circle of people who had been directly involved, was what had happened on the evening of October 14th, 11 years earlier, on a stretch of mountain road outside a small town called Cedar Creek, approximately 90 miles north of Millbrook. He had been driving back from a property assessment, a piece of land he had been considering for a development project, and he had been driving alone because he had given his driver the afternoon off, and the road had been wet from a storm that had passed through 2 hours earlier and left the asphalt slick and the drainage ditches full. He had taken a curve he had taken many times before, and something had gone wrong, whether it was the wet road or a momentary lapse in attention or a mechanical issue with the car. He had never been entirely certain, and the vehicle had left the road and gone over the embankment on the right side. It had tumbled down a slope that was steep enough to roll the car twice before it came to rest against a tree line some distance below the road surface. Richard had been conscious when the car stopped moving, which he had later been told was something of a miracle given the severity of the impact. He was bleeding from a gash above his right temple that was deep enough to have blurred his vision on the right side, and he had a broken collarbone and 2 cracked ribs that made each breath a specific and deliberate exercise in pain management. His phone had been in the center console, and the center console had been badly deformed in the crash, and when he finally managed to retrieve the phone, the screen was cracked and unresponsive. The road above him was not visible from where the car had come to rest, and the density of the trees around him meant that, even if he had been able to shout, there was no certainty that anyone passing on the road would hear him. He had understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people in genuine emergencies, that he was in serious trouble. The temperature was dropping. He was losing blood at a rate that concerned him. And the nearest town was a distance he could not have walked in ideal circumstances, let alone injured. Alone. In the dark. He had been there for what he estimated was slightly over an hour, when he heard, above him on the road, the sound of a vehicle slowing. He shouted. He heard a door open, and then he heard footsteps, quick, careful footsteps, on the wet slope coming down toward him. The young man who appeared at the passenger side window of the wrecked car was, at that point, 27 years old, lean from physical work, with dark eyes that assessed the situation in the swift, practical way of someone who understood machines and the bodies of injured people with equal competence. He had a first aid kit in his truck. He drove a truck, an old one, well-maintained, and he had a rope and a come-along and a flashlight, because he was the kind of person who kept things in his truck that might someday be needed. He had been on his way back from a job call, a vehicle breakdown on the same road, and he had stopped because the skid marks at the edge of the road had told him what had happened there as clearly as if there had been a sign. His name was Jack Turner. He was 27 years old. He was not yet the owner of a garage but was working toward it, saving money from his mechanic's wages and taking on private jobs on the side. He climbed down the embankment, assessed Richard's injuries with a steadiness that impressed Richard even through the haze of pain and blood loss, applied pressure to the head wound with gauze from the first aid kit, and then did something that Richard had never forgotten and never would. He made a calculation about the risk of moving an injured person against the risk of leaving him in deteriorating conditions, and he made that calculation quickly and correctly, and he acted on it. He could not get his truck down the embankment. He could not get Richard up to the road without assistance that was not available. So he built a makeshift stretcher from a tarp and 2 branches of appropriate diameter, and he pulled Richard onto it with a gentleness that cost him physical effort that was visible in the set of his jaw, and he began the process of getting him up the slope. It took 2 hours. The rain came back midway through. Jack did not stop. When they reached the road, he drove Richard himself, because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and the ambulance response time in that region was longer, and he knew the roads better than any dispatcher's estimate. He stayed until the emergency room doctors had assessed Richard's condition and told him that he would recover, and then he left before Richard was fully coherent, before anyone had thought to take down his name. And by the time Richard had the presence of mind to ask who had brought him in, the young man in the old truck was already gone. Richard had spent 4 months trying to find him. He had hired someone to make inquiries in Cedar Creek and the surrounding towns. And eventually, a name had surfaced. Jack Turner, mechanic, had been seen in the area that evening, had stopped at the diner in town for coffee before the accident was even reported. But by then, Jack had moved. He had relocated to Millbrook, to the converted warehouse on the east side. And in the process of rebuilding his life in a new place, he had become, to the ordinary mechanisms of search, briefly invisible. He had no business registration yet, no public footprint, only a rented building and a growing reputation that existed entirely through personal referral, and had not yet generated any documented trail. By the time Richard's investigator had a confirmed address, more than a year had passed since the accident. Richard had written to him. The letter had taken him 3 drafts to get right, which was unusual for a man who had written hundreds of significant business communications without much difficulty. But the circumstances fell outside any professional register he knew. Jack had written back a brief and courteous letter, thanking him for his kind words and declining, with equal courtesy, the very substantial financial offer that had accompanied Richard's correspondence. He said he appreciated the thought. He said he had done what anyone would have done. He said he hoped Richard was well. He did not write again. And Richard had not written a 3rd time, because it had become clear that pressing the matter further would be a failure to respect something Jack had communicated plainly and without ambiguity. Richard had thought about Jack Turner many times in the years since. He thought about him when he signed large contracts, and when he sat in boardrooms making decisions that would affect hundreds of people's lives, and he thought about him in the quiet moments before sleep, when the mind revisits the things that matter and discards the things that do not. He had thought about him at his daughter's graduation, when she had walked across the stage to collect her diploma, and he had felt the particular pride of a parent watching a child they love succeed, and then immediately thought about the fact that he would not have been there to watch it if a stranger with a rope and a first aid kit had not decided to stop. He thought about him on winter mornings when the news was full of stories about people failing each other, and the memory of what Jack had done in the rain on a mountain road felt like a kind of counterweight, a confirmation that the capacity for genuine decency had not entirely evacuated the world. He had never found an appropriate occasion to do what he felt needed to be done, which was to stand in front of the man and say, in plain terms, that his life had been saved by a stranger who had asked for nothing in return, and that this fact had shaped him in ways he was still in the process of understanding. And now, on an autumn evening, in a showroom full of beautiful cars, he had learned that his daughter had looked at that stranger and seen someone who did not belong. When Jack came back because Trevor found him in the parking lot, standing beside his truck with his keys in his hand, and explained that Richard Carter himself had asked him to return, he came back with the same unhurried calm with which he did everything, and he walked across the showroom floor, while people watched with the keen interest of a crowd that senses something significant is about to happen. Richard met him in the center of the room, and what Richard did surprised everyone present. He put both his hands on Jack's shoulders the way a person greets someone they love, and he said, in a voice that was steady but not quite controlled, I have been looking for a way to say this to you for 11 years, and I am going to say it now in front of everyone, because it is the truth, and it deserves to be said out loud. He told the room what had happened. He told them about the mountain road and the rain and the embankment and the 2 hours in the dark. He told them about the letter and the declined offer. He said, if not for this man, I would not be standing here. The room was entirely silent, and Olivia Carter, standing 10 feet away with her champagne glass held very still in one hand, felt something shift inside her chest that she did not have an immediate name for, but that would, in the days that followed, resolve itself into something she recognized as shame. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in her apartment with the lights of the city moving across the ceiling, and she replayed the scene in the showroom the way you replay a mistake obsessively, helplessly, looking for the moment where a different choice was still available. She thought about the expression on Jack's face when she had asked him if he knew the area was for invited guests, the particular patience of it, and she understood now that he had not been patient because he was deferential or because he lacked confidence. He had been patient because he was, simply and genuinely, a patient person. And the situation, however unpleasant, had not required anything more from him than patience. He had not needed to defend himself. He had not needed to prove anything. That was the part that stayed with her. The absence of need in him, when nearly everyone she dealt with was defined almost entirely by their needs for recognition, for status, for the visible markers of success that reassured them and everyone around them that they had arrived somewhere worth arriving at. She went to Turner Restoration the following week. She had thought about calling first and decided not to, on the grounds that calling gave him the opportunity to decline before she had said what she needed to say. And she suspected he would take that opportunity. She drove herself, in a car that was understated by her standards, and she parked in the small lot beside the garage and sat in the car for a moment before going in. Danny, who was working on a carburetor at the front bench, looked up when she came through the door, and then looked again with the expression of someone who is fairly certain they recognize a face, but cannot place the context. She asked for Jack. Danny disappeared into the back and came back a few minutes later and said, "Mr. Turner was in the middle of something but would be out shortly." She waited near the front, looking at the photographs on the wall before and after photographs of restorations, cars that had come in as wrecks and left as something close to art. She was looking at a photograph of what she eventually identified as a 1948 Packard Custom 8 when Jack came through the door from the back, wiping his hands on a cloth. He stopped when he saw her. His expression did not change significantly, but he went slightly still in the way of someone who is deciding something. He listened when she spoke. She had prepared what she was going to say, and then, standing in front of him in the concrete-floored garage with the smell of oil and metal in the air, she abandoned the prepared version and said what she actually meant, which was that she had treated him with contempt based on how he looked rather than who he was, and that she had done it publicly, and that she was sorry. Not sorry in the way people say they are sorry when they mean they are sorry to have been caught, but sorry in the way that acknowledges genuine wrongdoing. Jack listened to all of it. Then he said, quietly, that he appreciated her coming. He said he understood that the situation had looked a certain way from where she was standing. He did not say it was all right, because it hadn't been. and he was too honest a person to say otherwise, but he said he thought people were capable of better than their worst moments, and that he was willing to believe she was one of them. It was, Olivia thought, a more generous response than she deserved. She came back the following week, and the week after that. Not with any particular agenda, beyond a growing desire to understand something she had not previously considered worth understanding. She watched the way Jack moved through his work, the precision of it, the care, the way he would stop what he was doing when a customer came in and give them his full attention without any visible impatience. She watched the way Danny and his part-time helpers looked at him, which was not the way employees look at a boss they are merely tolerating, but the way apprentices look at someone they are actively learning from. She watched the way he talked to Maya on the afternoons. The girl came to the garage, seriously and without condescension, answering her technical questions with the same rigor he brought to everything else. She was beginning to understand that the metric she had always used to measure people, their title, their salary, their visibility, was measuring the wrong thing entirely. And she was also, though she was not yet ready to admit it even to herself, beginning to look forward to the days when she had a reason to return. The crisis arrived in December. It arrived, as crises often do, at the worst possible time and in the most inconvenient possible form. Carter Holdings had been developing an electric vehicle platform for 18 months in partnership with a mid-size manufacturer, a project that had been intended as the company's signal to the market that it was not merely invested in the future of transportation, but was actively building it. The launch had been scheduled for the first quarter of the coming year, and a prototype had been in testing for the past 3 months. The results of the testing had been, on the surface, acceptable. Underneath the surface, they were not. There was a thermal management problem in the battery pack, a flaw in the heat dissipation design that caused the pack to run at elevated temperatures under sustained load, which reduced both range and battery life in ways that would become apparent to consumers very quickly and very publicly. The engineering team had flagged it in internal documentation, but had characterized it as a known issue being actively managed rather than a fundamental design problem, and the characterization had moved through the organization in the way that comfortable news moves, quickly and without challenge. Jack had come to the company's technical facility to discuss a separate matter, a consultation on a vintage vehicle that was part of a promotional campaign, and while he was waiting for the appropriate person to become available, he had looked at the prototype documentation that had been left on a table in the conference room where he was waiting. The way a person with mechanical instincts automatically looks at mechanical documentation. He had read a paragraph, and then another, and then he had sat down and read the thermal management section in its entirety. He found Olivia's office because he asked the receptionist where it was. And when he came in, she looked up from her desk and saw something in his face that she had learned, in the weeks of visiting his garage, to take seriously: a focused, contained concern that was neither alarm nor dismissal. He put the documentation on her desk and pointed to the section he had been reading. And he explained, in clear and specific terms, what he believed the problem was and why he believed the proposed management solution would not be adequate over the product's intended life cycle. He said he thought the core issue was in the geometry of the cooling channels, and he described a modification approach that could address it without requiring a full redesign. Olivia's engineering team resisted the suggestion, initially, with the particular defensiveness of specialists who have just been told by an outsider that they have missed something. Jack did not argue. He provided documentation, drew a schematic at the whiteboard, and answered every technical objection with the patience of someone who has spent his professional life diagnosing problems that others have failed to solve. By the third hour of the meeting, 2 of the 4 engineers in the room had changed their position. By the following day, the testing data supported his assessment. The modification was implemented over 6 weeks of intensive work, and the revised prototype tested correctly. The launch was delayed by 1 quarter, which cost the company real money, but it launched correctly. The alternative, a product failure in market, with the attendant recall and reputational damage, would have cost far more. The board, initially disposed toward questioning Olivia's leadership through the crisis, reversed its position when the full account of events was made available to them. Richard, who had been briefed privately, said very little. but the particular quality of his silence communicated what words would have made too obvious. Olivia began asking different questions after that. She asked Jack, over coffee in his side office on a cold afternoon in February, where he had developed that level of technical knowledge. He answered directly, without particular drama. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from a state university, followed by 5 years at a manufacturing firm where he had worked on drivetrain and thermal systems, followed by another 3 years at a consulting firm where he had assessed mechanical designs for major automotive clients. He had left consulting 11 years ago, when his mother's health declined and required his full attention. And during those final months of her life, he had begun working on cars again, the physical work, the manual precision, the satisfaction of a problem solved in material rather than theoretical terms. And when she died, he had looked at his life and decided that the version of success he had been building before was not the version he wanted. He had found the warehouse in Millbrook. He had put every skill he had into the work itself, and the work had been enough, and then more than enough, and he had never seriously considered going back. She looked at him for a moment when he finished, and he met her eyes with the same calm steadiness that had unsettled her the first time she saw it. She said, "You never told anyone any of this." He said there had never been a particular reason to. She said, "You must have thought we were all very superficial." He considered this for a moment, genuinely, and without the performance of consideration, the way someone thinks about a question they take seriously, and then he said he thought most people were working with the information they had, and that the information most people had about each other was insufficient, and that this was a condition of life rather than a moral failing, though it did suggest that the best response was to be curious rather than to assume. He said he thought curiosity was underrated as a professional skill, that it was cheaper than most of the consultants people hired, and more reliable than most of the assumptions they made, and that it was available to anyone willing to be momentarily uncertain. He said this last part without any particular edge in it. But Olivia felt it land with a precision that she suspected was not entirely accidental. It was, she thought, the most precise description of her own mistake that she had ever heard, and it had been offered without any apparent intent to make the point. The company held its annual celebration in March, in the largest venue in Millbrook, with an attendance of 1,400 people that included investors, partners, employees, local officials, and press. The room had been arranged with the care that goes into events designed to project a particular version of a company's identity. White floral arrangements of the architecturally considered kind, lighting that was flattering rather than functional, a stage with a screen behind it, showing a slow-rolling highlight reel of the company's year. Olivia had reviewed every element of the evening's production the week before, and it had been flawless in the way that things Olivia organized tended to be flawless, because she understood logistics, the way her father understood people, with a precision that came from paying close attention over a long period of time. It was the kind of event she had organized and hosted many times, and she ran it, as she ran everything, with detailed competence. But when she reached the podium for the keynote address and looked out at the 1,400 faces arranged in the warm light before her, she departed from the prepared remarks at the midway point. She set down the card she had been holding, the one with the talking points about quarterly performance and strategic positioning, and she looked out at the room and told them what had happened in December. Not the sanitized version, not the version in which a valued external consultant had identified an opportunity for improvement, but the actual version in which a mechanic she had publicly humiliated at an automotive exhibition had walked into her company's conference room and saved a product launch. She told them she had invited him tonight. She said his name. She asked him to come to the stage. Jack came to the stage in the same unhurried way he did everything, wearing a suit that fit better than the last one she had seen him in, and he stood at the podium with the particular ease of a person who has long since stopped caring whether or not he impresses anyone. He did not grip the sides of the podium or shift his weight or do any of the small things people do when they are nervous in front of crowds, because he was not nervous, and the absence of that familiar performance of confidence, which is so often mistaken for the real thing, was itself a kind of presence. The audience was quiet, with the specific quality of an audience that is paying genuine attention rather than performing it. The difference between a room that is waiting to applaud and a room that is actually listening. Olivia stood beside him, and she said that she owed him a public apology for a public humiliation, and she gave it, clearly, and without qualification. Without the softening language people use when they want credit for the apology, while minimizing what required it, and the room responded with a sound that was partly applause and partly something else. A collective exhale. Perhaps, the sound of people recognizing a moment they had not expected to see in a venue like this, in a room organized around the display of success. Richard Carter, seated in the front row, watched his daughter with an expression that had not been visible on his face in some years, which was uncomplicated pride. Richard came to the podium when Olivia stepped aside, and he gripped the edge of it with both hands in the manner of a man who wants to say something correctly and is taking the time to ensure he does. He said he had been thinking, for 11 years, about what it meant that a stranger on a mountain road had made a choice to stop and help a man he did not know, and had made that choice completely and without reservation and without any apparent expectation that it would be recognized or rewarded. He said he had a great deal of money, and he had built a company that employed a great many people, and he had been fortunate in ways that he understood were not the product of merit alone. But he said that the single action that had made everything else possible was not his own. It was the action of a young man with a truck and a first aid kit, and the kind of character that does not require an audience. He paused, and then he said, "Money creates wealthy people, but goodness creates great ones." The room stayed quiet for a moment before it responded, and the response, when it came, was long. In the weeks that followed, Olivia and Jack saw each other with a frequency that began as professional and transitioned, gradually and without any particular dramatic moment marking the shift, into something that occupied a different category. They had coffee at the diner 2 blocks from the garage, which became a regular Tuesday morning before Jack's workday started in earnest. They had dinner once, at a restaurant that was Olivia's suggestion and that Jack arrived at on time, and left having paid the check while she was in the middle of a sentence, which made her laugh for the first time in a way she had not expected, and that seemed, to both of them, to indicate something. She visited the garage on a Saturday and found Maya there, eating crackers at the small desk by the window. And Maya looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who takes no one's measure for granted and makes no allowances for status, and then asked her a technical question about the engine in the car. She had driven something about the sound it made under deceleration which Olivia could not answer, and Jack answered it for her. And Maya nodded seriously, as if logging the information, and the 3 of them stood in the garage for an hour, talking about the relative merits of different carburetor designs, while the afternoon light moved across the concrete floor, and Olivia thought, not for the first time, that she had been operating for most of her adult life with a map that did not reflect the actual terrain. Jack did not change what his life looked like. The garage remained what it was. The same converted warehouse. The same hand-painted sign fading to a comfortable green. The same filing system that made sense only to him. The same waiting list of 14 to 18 months that continued to grow, not because Jack advertised or sought publicity, but because the work remained what it had always been. He turned down 2 interview requests from automotive publications during the winter months, not out of false modesty, but because he did not have a great deal to say that the cars themselves did not already say better. He did not take the full consulting arrangement that Richard offered him. Richard had put it to him generously, framed as an advisory role with a title and a meaningful salary, because accepting it in its entirety would have altered the structure of his days in ways he was not interested in altering. He agreed, instead, to review technical documentation on a periodic basis, the kind of work he could do in the mornings before the garage opened, drinking his first cup of coffee at the side desk with the technical drawings spread across the surface, and he set a fee for it that was appropriate to the service, and no more than that. He remained, in all the ways that mattered, exactly what he had been before a woman in a copper-colored gown had looked at his work clothes and decided she already knew everything worth knowing about him. The garage did not know what had happened. The garage did not care. The carburetor waiting to be reassembled on the bench had its own requirements, and they were the same as they had always been, and they were enough. There is a particular kind of person whose value to the world around them is only visible to those who are paying careful attention and it is almost always the case that this person already knows their own value and does not require anyone else's confirmation of it. Jack Turner was this kind of person. He had known who he was for a long time, and the events of the autumn and winter had not altered his understanding of himself in any fundamental way. What they had altered, somewhat, was his understanding of other people, or rather, his confirmation of something he had suspected but not had recent occasion to test, which was that people, when confronted honestly with their own errors, are more capable of genuine change than the surface of most professional environments would suggest. He had watched Olivia Carter revise herself in real time over the course of several months, and it had been, he would have said if asked, one of the more remarkable things he had witnessed. Olivia told her father, in a quiet conversation in his study in April, that she thought she understood now what he had meant when he told her, years ago, that the hardest part of leadership was not making decisions, but learning to see people accurately. Her father had told her this more than once, and she had nodded and filed it alongside other pieces of advice that made sense in the abstract without fully landing in the practical. It had taken a man in a stained work jacket, quietly turning to leave a room in which he had been made to feel unwelcome, to make it land. Richard had said he thought that was probably the way it worked for most people, that the lessons that actually changed you came not from advice, but from the specific occasions when your understanding failed and reality corrected it. He had said he was sorry it had happened in public. She had said she thought that might have been necessary. He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had said that she might be right. The Hudson Hornet was displayed, in the end, at a smaller exhibition the following spring, a collector show held in a local fairground rather than a corporate showroom, an event attended by enthusiasts rather than investors. There were no champagne flutes at this event, no VIP cordons, no women in copper-colored gowns assessing the room. There were people who knew what a 1953 Hudson Hornet was, who understood what it had taken to bring one back from the condition this one had been in, and who stood in front of it for a long time, in the specific silence of people who appreciate something deeply and do not need to explain why. It won its category. The award was a small plaque, and Jack took it home and hung it on the wall of the garage next to the before and after photographs, and it sat there among the evidence of 11 years of precise and careful work, not elevated above anything, not separate from anything, exactly where it belonged. Maya asked him once, during the period when things were changing around them, whether any of it, the recognition, the events, the people, had felt different from what he expected. He thought about it for a while, which was how he thought about most things that deserved thought. And then he said that the most surprising thing had been how little surprise he had felt. The world had looked, through all of it, more or less the way he had always believed it looked. Full of people who were capable of being better than they currently were, which was not a criticism but an observation, and the kind of observation that made it possible to keep going. He said he thought that was probably enough. Maya, who was 9 years old, and drew horses in the margins of notebooks, and asked technical questions that Danny could not always answer, said she thought so too. The man who had been laughed at that evening had not, in any meaningful sense, needed the room's approval. He had come because a car he had spent 2 years building deserved to be seen, and it had been seen, and that was the thing that mattered. The rest of it, the laughter, the dismissal, the security officer, the humiliation designed to put him in his place, had passed over him the way weather passes over a mountain. He was still there. He had always been there. He had simply been waiting, with the patience of someone who knows the value of what they have built, for the rest of the room to catch up. The man who had been laughed at that evening turned out to be the most deserving of respect of anyone in the room.